They said Pharaoh Merikare would rule forever. They said his power was ordained by the gods, his bloodline blessed by the stars. But gods lie, and blood spills. The throne room reeked of incense and death, of wine spilt over stone floors as courtiers wept and priests chanted in desperate whispers. Queen Anipe knelt beside her husband's body, hands soaked in the blood that once ran through his veins like the Nile. His crown lay on the ground, gold tarnished by sweat, as if even the metal knew it had lost its king. Outside, the palace doors creaked open, and in came Prince Aken, a boy of 16 with eyes dark as the abyss. He stared at his father's lifeless body, at the man who once held him on his lap and promised him a kingdom that would never fall. But empires do fall, and now Aken's knees did too, crashing to the floor as the high priest stepped forward. "The throne must not be empty," he said, voice as cold as the marble beneath their feet. "The bloodline must be preserved." Anipe's chest heaved. "Aken is too young to rule alone. The nobles will devour him." The priest's gaze never left her. "Then he will not rule alone." Anipe's heart stuttered. "What are you saying?" The priest stepped closer, the scent of frankincense and rot clinging to his robes. "There is one way to keep the throne within the bloodline. You, Anipe, must marry the king." "The king is dead," she snapped, voice breaking. "Not that king," he said, turning to Aken. "This one." The world went silent. Aken's eyes lifted to his mother, and in that single glance, Anipe felt her heart shatter and reassemble all at once. He was her son, he was her boy, but now he was her king, and soon he would be her husband. The priest dropped a ring at Aken's feet. "For the throne to live, you must make her your queen." Aken's jaw clenched, and for a moment, his eyes met Anipe's. She searched for the boy she once held against her chest, the son who whispered her name in the dark. But the boy was gone, and in his place stood a king made of stone, a pharaoh crowned in blood. The great hall was a tomb, and they were the ghosts being bound to it. The columns rose like watchful sentinels, and the priest's chants echoed like knives scraping against stone. Anipe stood beneath the towering statue of Hathor, the goddess of love, her wedding robes heavy with gold and dread. The priests draped her in a veil that smelled of myrrh and death, as if they were preparing her for burial, not marriage. Aken stood across from her, his jaw clenched, eyes hollow. He wore the crown now, its weight pressing down on a brow too young to bear it. His father's blood still stained the gold. The high priest stepped forward, raising his arms to the gods. "We gather to seal the union between Pharaoh Aken and Queen Anipe, a union of blood to preserve the throne, a union of power to prevent the fall." Anipe's heart hammered against her ribs. She was a queen, a widow, a mother, but now she was being made a wife to her own son. She dared to look up. Aken's eyes met hers, dark and unreadable, and in that moment, the boy she had once cradled was gone. In his place was a man who wore a crown, but looked as if he were drowning beneath it. "Repeat after me," the priest said. Aken swallowed, throat tight. "I, Pharaoh Aken, take you, Queen Anipe, as my wife, my queen, and my blood." His voice wavered, and for a moment she thought he might run. But then his jaw clenched, and he continued. "To protect the throne and preserve the bloodline." Anipe's vision blurred. This wasn't a marriage. This was a curse. "I, Queen Anipe," she whispered, her voice breaking like a cracked vase, "take you, Pharaoh Aken, as my husband, my king, and my blood." Aken's hand trembled as he took hers. His fingers wrapped around hers like a lifeline, or a shackle. The crowd watched in silence, nobles' eyes sharp as daggers, priests' faces blank as stone. No one spoke. No one dared. "By the will of the gods," the high priest intoned, "you are now bound, as king and queen, as husband and wife." The crowd erupted in forced applause, but all Anipe could hear was the shattering of her own heart. Aken leaned close, his breath hot against her ear. "Forgive me, mother." She closed her eyes, letting the veil hide her tears. "Forgive me too, my king." That night they would be alone in the same chambers, two bodies bound by blood and power. Two hearts now bound by a curse neither asked for but both must endure. The palace had once been a sanctuary. Now it was a labyrinth of whispers and shadows, a gilded cage wrapped in silk and stone. The throne room echoed with the sounds of court, priests chanting prayers, nobles exchanging poisoned smiles. Akin seated high upon the throne that once belonged to his father, but there was no crown heavier than the eyes that watched him, no scepter sharper than the whispers that pricked his ears. "He is too young," they said. "The boy is a puppet, and his mother holds the strings." Anipe stood at the base of the dais, a statue draped in linen and gold, her eyes fixed on her son, her husband, her king. Akin met her gaze but did not speak. He couldn't. Not here, not under the eyes of those who expected him to fail. "Bring the tribute," Akin commanded, his voice harder than he intended. Guards dragged forth a man bound in chains, a general who had spoken out against the marriage, against the union of a mother and son. The man spat blood, his eyes blazing. "You may call yourself king, but you're still a boy playing dress-up in your father's robes." Akin's jaw tightened. "Then let me prove I'm more than that." He rose, descending the dais with the grace of a lion stalking prey. He knelt before the general, grabbing a fistful of his hair, pulling his head back so their eyes met. "You called me a boy," Akin said softly, his breath hot against the man's ear. "What do you call me now?" Anipe's heart pounded. This was not the son she raised. This was someone darker, someone forged in the fires of a throne too soon claimed. "Akin," she said, her voice a whisper that cut through the silence. "Enough." He looked at her, and in that moment, she saw it. The hurt, the fear, the rage of a boy forced to be a man too soon. But he couldn't stop now. Not in front of them. Not in front of her. "I'm Pharaoh," he said, rising to his full height, "and my word is law." The general's scream echoed through the hall as Akin ordered him taken away. When the doors slammed shut, the crowd began to disperse, their whispers trailing behind like snakes slithering across marble. Anipe stayed behind, her fists clenched, her heart pounding. "Akin," she said when they were alone, her voice tight. "That was not you." He turned to her, and in that moment, she couldn't tell if he was the boy she raised or the man she feared. "I did it for us," he said, his jaw set. "For the throne." "And for me?" she asked, stepping closer, the scent of his father's blood still lingering on his robes. Akin's eyes dropped to her lips, then to her throat, then back to her eyes. "For you," he said, his voice raw. "I did it all for you." The air between them crackled like a storm waiting to break. Anipe swallowed, her pulse thrumming beneath her skin. "We are bound by blood," she said, her words trembling. "Not by choice." Akin leaned closer, his breath warm against her cheek. "Then make it a choice." Anipe shivered, the line between mother and queen blurring beneath the weight of his gaze. But before she could answer, the high priest's voice echoed down the hall. A warning, a reminder, a curse. "The gods are watching." And with that, the spell was broken. Akin pulled away, his eyes dark, his jaw clenched. "Then let them watch," he muttered, turning away, his shadow long and heavy as it stretched across the throne room floor. The palace corridors were colder now. Shadows moved like whispers behind silk curtains, and the scent of frankincense hung heavy in the air, a perfume meant to mask the rot beneath the gold. Anipe walked alone, her robes trailing behind her like the train of a funeral shroud. The nobles called her the Queen Mother. The priests called her the Queen Consort, but in her own mind, she was just a woman trapped between blood and desire. She found Akin in the royal gardens, standing beneath the acacia tree where he once played as a boy, where she once sang lullabies to him under a sky filled with stars. Now he stood like a man made of stone, his jaw clenched, his fists white-knuckled. "Akin," she said softly, "you shouldn't be out here alone." He didn't turn to her. "Alone is all I am." Anipe stepped closer, her heart pounding in her chest. The air between them was thick, not with words, but with something unspeakable. "You're not alone," she said, her voice catching. You have me." At that, he finally looked at her. And in his eyes, she saw it. The boy she raised, the king he was trying to be, and the man he was becoming. "Do I?" he said, stepping closer. "Because all I see is a queen who won't look at her king." Anipe swallowed, her pulse thrumming in her throat. "You are my son," she said, but the words came out weaker than she intended. "I am your husband," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. "By law, by blood." He stepped closer still, so close she could feel his breath on her skin. "Do you still see me as a boy?" he asked, his fingers grazing her cheek. Anipe's breath hitched. His touch was warm, too warm, and his eyes darkened as he watched her. "Tell me you don't feel it," he whispered, his thumb tracing the curve of her jaw. "Tell me you don't want this." Anipe's knees trembled. The acacia leaves rustled above them, a sound like whispers, like judgment. She closed her eyes, and in that moment, she felt the weight of his hand, the heat of his body, the ache of something she couldn't name. "Akin," she breathed, and it was more a prayer than a name. But before she could say more, a servant's voice echoed through the garden, shattering the moment. "Pharaoh, the high priest requests your presence." Akin pulled away, jaw clenched, eyes stormy. "Then let him wait," he said, voice like a growl. Anipe turned away, her cheeks flushed, her heart pounding as she fled the garden. But she could still feel his touch on her skin, could still hear his voice in her ear, a voice that was no longer her son's, but that of a man she could no longer deny. The palace hummed with the sound of drums and flutes as the festival of Hathor unfolded beneath the moonlit sky. The great hall blazed with torches, their flames casting shadows that danced like restless spirits. Nobles draped in gold and silk swayed to the music, their eyes glittering with secrets, their lips curled into knowing smiles. At the center of it all sat Akin and Anipe side by side on the throne, a king and his queen, a son and his mother, two bodies bound by blood, two souls tethered by something far more dangerous. "To Pharaoh Akin," the high priest intoned, raising his goblet high, "and to Queen Anipe, the heart that keeps his throne beating." The crowd echoed the toast, but Anipe's hand trembled around her cup. Wine sloshed over the rim, staining her wrist red as Akin's eyes slid to hers. "Are you afraid?" he murmured, voice low enough for only her to hear. "Of what?" she whispered, her throat dry. "Of me," he said, his gaze intense, a storm brewing beneath his lashes. Anipe swallowed, but before she could answer, a noblewoman approached, bowing low before Akin, her gown shimmering like a serpent's scales. "Would Pharaoh grant me the honor of a dance?" The woman purred, her eyes roaming over Akin like a hungry cat. Akin's jaw tightened, his knuckles white around the goblet. "No," the woman blinked, her smile faltering. "But, my king—" "I said no," Akin snapped, his voice a crack of thunder. The music faltered, the crowd stilled, and in that silence, Akin rose, his eyes burning. "The only woman I dance with tonight," he said, his voice dark as the Nile at midnight, "is my queen." He held out his hand, and the hall fell silent as Anipe stood, her pulse thrumming beneath her skin. The crowd parted as Akin led her to the center of the room, the music starting up again, slow and sultry, a rhythm that echoed the pounding of her heart. His hand slid to her waist, pulling her close, his breath hot against her ear. "You're shaking," he said, his lips grazing her temple. "Am I?" she whispered, her hands on his shoulders, her fingers curling into his robes. "Do you know what they're saying?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. "They're saying you bewitched me, that you used your beauty to keep me under your spell." Anipe's heart hammered in her chest. "And do you believe them?" Akin leaned closer, his mouth so close to hers that she could feel the heat of his breath, could smell the wine on his lips. "No," he said, his eyes burning into hers. "But maybe you should." And before she could answer, he kissed her. Right there in the middle of the great hall, in front of nobles and priests and servants, His lips claimed hers, not like a son kissing his mother, but like a man devouring the woman who haunted his dreams. The crowd gasped, whispers spreading like wildfire, but Anipe didn't hear them. All she could feel was Akin's mouth on hers, his hands tight around her waist, his breath mingling with hers as the world around them fell away. When he finally pulled back, his eyes were dark, his chest heaving. "Now," he said, his voice rough, his thumb brushing her lower lip. "Who's bewitched who?" The torches still burned in the great hall, their flames flickering like tongues of gossip that refused to die. The nobles had left, their whispers trailing behind them like the scent of spilt wine. But the throne room was not empty. Not yet. Anipe stood alone, her chest heaving, her lips still swollen from Akin's kiss. The air was thick with the scent of myrrh and something darker, something that tasted like regret and burned like desire. "Queen Anipe!" a voice rasped, and she turned to see the high priest emerge from the shadows, his robes billowing around him like a black cloud. His eyes glittered like a serpent's, sharp and unblinking. "What you have done tonight," he said, voice dripping with poison, "has condemned you." Anipe lifted her chin, though her knees trembled. "I did nothing," she said, her voice cold as the Nile in winter. "Nothing?" the high priest sneered, stepping closer, his breath foul with incense. "You bewitched him. You put a spell on your own son. You have tainted the throne." Anipe's jaw clenched. "You speak of spells and curses," she said, her fists curling beneath her robes. "But what about the curse you laid on me when you forced me to marry my own child?" The high priest's eyes narrowed, his lips pulling back to reveal yellowed teeth. "I did what was necessary to keep the throne within the bloodline, but now you have taken it too far." "Taken it too far?" Akin's voice echoed from behind them, a dark rumble that sent a chill down Anipe's spine. The high priest stiffened, but he did not turn. "Your Highness," he said, voice dripping with false reverence, "your mother has—" "My queen," Akin said, stepping into the light, his gaze locked onto Anipe like a predator who had found his prey. "She is my queen, and you will speak to her with respect." The high priest swallowed, sweat beading along his brow. "The people are talking, my king," he said, his voice quivering. "They say you are under her spell, that she has bewitched you to keep her hold on the throne." Akin's lips curled into a dangerous smile. "Let them talk," he said, his hand reaching out to grasp Anipe's wrist. His fingers were like iron, his grip possessive. "Let them say what they will." The high priest's eyes flicked to Anipe, and she could feel his hatred like a blade pressed to her throat. "The gods will not forgive this," he said, voice trembling. "They will not forgive a love as cursed as yours." "Then let them curse us," Akin said, his eyes dark and glittering. "Let them curse us to the ends of time." And without another word, he pulled Anipe to him, his hand sliding to the back of her neck as he kissed her, a kiss that tasted of wine and power, of love and sin. The high priest fled the hall, his robe swirling like a raven's wings, but Anipe couldn't move. She was trapped in Akin's embrace, her body melting against his, her heart pounding in time with his. When he finally pulled away, his breath was ragged, his eyes wild. "They can curse us all they want," he said, his lips grazing her ear. "But you are mine. You have always been mine." Anipe shuddered, her hands clenching in his robes. "And what if I don't want to be yours?" Akin's hand slid to her throat, his thumb stroking her pulse. "Then you should not have kissed me back." The whispers spread like locusts, devouring Thebes from the inside. The people spoke in hushed tones of a queen who bewitched her own son, of a king who was no longer a man but a puppet wrapped around his mother's finger. In the palace, the high priest moved through the halls like a shadow, his eyes sharp, his mouth twisted into a snarl. "They are cursed," he told the generals, his voice as venomous as a scorpion's sting. "Their love is a sin that will bring down the throne. The gods demand blood." "Whose blood?" a general asked, voice shaking. The high priest's eyes glinted. "Theirs." But behind the closed doors of the royal chambers, another battle was being waged. Anipe paced the room, her bare feet cold against the marble floor, her robe slipping from her shoulders. The night was heavy, the air thick with the scent of sandalwood and the echo of words she could not forget. "You are mine. You have always been mine." Aiken stood at the window, his back to her, his hands clenched around the stone ledge. The moonlight bathed him in silver, casting his shadow long and dark across the room. "What are they saying about me?" he asked, his voice tight, his jaw set. Anipe swallowed, her throat dry. "They say I have bewitched you, that I have used my body to keep you under my control." Aiken's hands gripped the ledge harder, his knuckles white. "And what do you say?" Anipe hesitated. "What do you want me to say?" Aiken turned then, his eyes blazing like a storm at sea. "Tell me it isn't true." Anipe's heart hammered against her ribs. "Of course it isn't true," she said, stepping closer. "You are my son. You are my king." "I am your husband," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. "And every time you say otherwise, it feels like a lie." Anipe took another step forward, her pulse thrumming beneath her skin. "Akin, do you regret it?" he asked, his eyes locked onto hers, his breath heavy. "Do you regret being mine?" Anipe swallowed, her chest heaving. "You are my son." "Stop saying that," he roared, his hand striking the wall, the impact echoing through the room. Anipe flinched, but she didn't retreat. Instead, she stepped closer, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body, close enough to smell the wine on his breath. "You want me to stop saying it?" she said, her voice trembling. "Then stop making me feel it." Aiken's jaw clenched, his eyes burning as he reached for her, his hands gripping her shoulders, his touch rough and desperate. "You are the only thing that keeps me sane," he whispered, his forehead pressing against hers. "Without you, I am nothing." Anipe's eyes closed, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Akin, you are a king. You are everything." "I am a man," he said, his hands sliding down to her waist, his fingers digging into her flesh. "A man who wants his queen." And then his mouth was on hers, his kiss hard and possessive, a claim, a punishment, a plea. Anipe's nails bit into his shoulders, her breath hitching as his hands roamed her body, as his lips trailed down her throat. But as she gasped his name, a crash echoed through the halls. The sound of doors slamming open, the sound of soldiers shouting, the sound of the high priest screaming, "They are cursed! They must be destroyed!" The palace thundered with the sound of fists pounding against doors, of swords clashing against shields, of men shouting and priests chanting in frenzied unison. The high priest stood at the gates, his robes billowing like a dark storm cloud, his eyes wild with righteous fury. "They are cursed!" he screamed, his voice echoing through the halls. "The queen has bewitched the king! The gods demand justice!" Soldiers surged forward, their torches blazing, their swords drawn. The great hall was under siege, but inside the royal chambers another war was being waged. Akin held Anipe tight against his chest, his breath hot and ragged against her ear. "They're coming for us," he said, his grip like iron, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. "They want to take you from me." Anipe trembled, her nails digging into his back, her heart hammering like a trapped bird. "Akin, please," she whispered, but the words felt hollow. "We cannot fight them." Akin pulled back, his eyes wild, his jaw clenched. "I am the king," he said, his fists shaking. "And they will not take what is mine." Anipe swallowed, her gaze dropping to the blood staining his robes, blood that was not his own. "What have you done?" Akin's mouth twisted into a dark smile. "I did what I had to. They called you a witch. They said you were controlling me. They said you were a demon disguised as my mother." He grabbed her chin, forcing her to look at him, his thumb stroking her lower lip. "But I know what you are. You are my queen, my wife, my blood." Anipe's eyes filled with tears, the weight of his words pressing down on her like a mountain. "Akin, this has to stop. You're losing yourself." "I am finding myself," he said, his lips grazing her cheek, his breath hot against her skin. For the first time, I know who I am. I am not your son. I am not just your king. His hand slid to her waist, pulling her closer, his mouth brushing hers. I am the man who will die to keep you. A crash echoed through the hall, the sound of doors splintering, of soldiers pouring in like a flood of locusts. "Seize them!" the high priest shouted, his eyes burning with vengeance. "They are cursed! They have defied the gods!" Akin pulled away, his chest heaving, his eyes blazing as he drew his sword. "You will not take her!" he said, stepping in front of Anipe, his body a shield, his gaze a storm. "You will have to kill me first!" The soldiers charged, their swords flashing, their shouts a deafening roar. Akin swung his blade, the metal singing through the air, slicing through flesh and bone. Blood sprayed across the walls, the floor, his skin. Anipe watched, her breath coming in sharp gasps, her heart breaking with every strike, every scream. "Akin!" she cried. But he did not hear her. He was a man possessed, a king who had nothing left to lose but the woman he loved, the woman he would kill for, the woman he would die for. The high priest stepped forward, his hands raised, his eyes glowing with madness. "The gods have spoken!" he screamed. "And they demand blood!" Akin turned, his chest heaving, his eyes wild. "Then take mine," he said, his sword raised, his voice a roar that echoed through the palace. "But you will never touch her." The high priest's lips twisted into a sneer. "You are already dead, Pharaoh," he said, his voice a whisper that dripped like poison. "You just don't know it yet." And with that, the ground beneath them trembled. The statues of the gods lining the hall shook, their eyes seeming to glow, their mouths opening as if to scream. Anipe clung to Akin, her nails digging into his flesh, her breath hitching as the air around them grew heavy, as the world itself seemed to hold its breath. "Akin," she whispered, her eyes wide, her heart breaking. "What have we done?" The great hall was a battlefield drenched in blood. Bodies lay sprawled across the marble floor, eyes staring blankly into the abyss, swords still clutched in lifeless hands. The torches flickered like dying stars, their flames casting shadows that twisted and writhed like spirits desperate to escape. Akin stood at the center of it all, his chest heaving, his sword dripping with blood. His once white robes were now stained crimson, his jaw clenched, his eyes wild. But it wasn't the soldier's blood on his hands, it was the high priest's. The man's body lay crumpled at Akin's feet, his throat slit, his eyes staring lifelessly at the ceiling that had begun to crack. "Akin," Anipe whispered, her voice trembling, her body pressed against the wall. "What have you done?" Akin's chest rose and fell, his breath ragged, his eyes blazing as he turned to face her. "I did what I had to," he said, his voice dark and hollow. "They were going to take you from me. They were going to kill you." Anipe's heart hammered against her ribs. "You killed them all." Akin dropped the sword, the clang echoing through the hall like a death knell. "For you," he said, his voice breaking. "I did it all for you." Anipe stepped forward, her bare feet slipping on the blood-soaked floor, her eyes locked onto Akin's. "This is not you," she said, her hands trembling as she reached for him. "You're not this monster." Akin's jaw clenched, his hands fisting at his sides. "I am whatever you want me to be," he said, his voice raw, his eyes burning. "I am your son. I am your king. I am your husband. But more than anything—" He grabbed her wrists, his grip hard, his breath hot against her face. "I am yours." Anipe gasped as he pulled her against him, his lips crashing down onto hers in a kiss that tasted of blood and tears and desperation. Her hands gripped his shoulders, her nails digging into his flesh as she kissed him back, as she let herself fall into the darkness with him, as the walls around them began to tremble and crack. The ground shook beneath their feet, and outside, the people of Thebes screamed as the sky opened up and rain poured down like the tears of the gods. "It's the curse," Anipe whispered, her forehead pressed against Akin's. "The gods are punishing us." "Let them," Akin said, his arms tightening around her, his eyes dark and unyielding. Let them curse us until the end of time. And then a door crashed open, and a dozen soldiers stormed into the hall, swords drawn, eyes blazing. There, one of them shouted. The false king! The witch queen! Akin pushed Anipe behind him, his body shielding hers, his jaw set, his fists clenched. Leave, he said, his voice low and deadly, or you will die. But the soldiers did not leave. They surged forward, their swords raised, their eyes filled with hatred and vengeance. Akin roared as he lunged at them, fists flying, blood spraying, the sound of bones breaking echoing through the hall. Anipe watched, her heart in her throat, as Akin fought like a man possessed. As he struck down soldier after soldier, his fists drenched in blood, his eyes wild and desperate. But there were too many. They swarmed him, blades slashing, fists pounding, and Anipe screamed as Akin fell to his knees, blood pouring from his mouth, his eyes still locked onto hers. Anipe, he gasped, his hands reaching for her, his body collapsing to the floor. Forgive me. No! Anipe screamed, falling to her knees beside him, her hands pressing against his wounds, her tears mixing with his blood. Stay with me. Akin's hand lifted, his bloodied fingers brushing her cheek, his eyes softening as he whispered, I love you. And then his eyes closed, his hand fell limp, and the last breath left his body as the throne room crumbled around them, as the gods wept from the sky, as the curse that had begun with a kiss ended with a scream. The throne room was a tomb. The floor was littered with bodies, the walls stained with blood, and the air thick with the scent of death and dying prayers. The sky outside had turned black, the wind howling like a grieving mother, and the rain poured down like the tears of 1,000 gods. Anipe sat alone in the center of it all, her knees soaked in blood, her arms wrapped around the lifeless body of the man who had once been her son, her king, her lover. Akin, she whispered, her fingers stroking his blood-soaked hair, her tears falling onto his still, unblinking eyes. I am here. I am still here. But Akin did not answer. His lips, once so warm against hers, were cold. His eyes, once so dark and full of fire, were empty. And the heart that had once beaten only for her was still. The high priest's body lay nearby, his throat slit, his eyes staring blankly at the ceiling, his mouth twisted in a silent scream. The soldiers lay scattered around him, their swords still clutched in lifeless hands, their blood pooling around Anipe like a crimson river. The throne, the cursed throne, sat empty, its gold stained with the blood of a boy who never should have been a king, a boy who had loved too much and lost too soon. You said you would never leave me, Anipe whispered, pressing her lips to Akin's forehead, her tears mingling with the blood on his skin. You promised. The doors creaked open, and the nobles filed in, their faces pale, their eyes wide, their lips curled in disgust and fear. The queen, one of them muttered, his eyes fixed on Anipe. She bewitched him. She made him kill them all. She is a witch, another whispered, stepping back, his hand raised as if to ward off a curse. She has brought the wrath of the gods upon us. Anipe did not hear them. All she could hear was Akin's last breath, echoing in her ears, haunting her like a song that would never end. Take her away, one of the nobles commanded, his voice hard and cold. Take the witch to the desert. Let the gods judge her. Guards moved forward, their eyes averted, their hands shaking as they wrenched Akin's body from Anipe's arms, as they dragged her to her feet, as they shackled her wrists in iron chains. No! Anipe screamed, her voice shattering the silence, her nails clawing at the guards. Akin! Akin! But Akin was gone, the boy she had raised, the king she had crowned, the man she had loved. Gone. They dragged her through the palace, through the streets, through the desert, the sand whipping against her skin, the wind howling like a beast. They took her to the edge of the desert, to a pit dug deep into the earth, and they threw her inside, the sand swallowing her like a grave. The gods will judge you. The high priest's voice echoed in her mind. The gods will curse you for what you have done. Days passed, nights blurred. Anipe lay in the sand, her body broken, her heart bleeding, her eyes fixed on the sky. And then she began to dig, with her hands, with her nails, with the last shred of strength she had left. She dug and dug until her fingers bled, until her arms trembled, until she hit stone. A tombstone, Akin's tombstone, carved with words that made her heart shatter all over again. He was my son, my king, my lover, and I loved him in all the ways a woman can love. Anipe fell to her knees, her hands clutching the stone, her lips pressed to the words she had once whispered in the dark, words that had now become a curse, a prayer, a legend. Akin, she whispered, her tears falling onto the stone. Forgive me. And as the desert wind howled around her, as the gods watched from the heavens, as the sand swallowed her whole, Anipe closed her eyes and let herself be buried beside the boy she had loved, the king she had lost, the man who had been hers, in life, in death, and in all the cursed years that would follow.